All right, let me start. Well, first, thank you very much for joining the afternoon session. And this is obviously my pleasure to give a talk in this pretty important and well-recognized meeting, online meeting series. So my topic is plastic waste in waste disposal sites and their re-exposure and release potentials. Meaning, well, I'm going to talk about plastic waste and landfills, and not so much about the experimental results or mechanisms and reactions. I think this presentation I'm going to focus mainly on the background information and some of the common knowledges and maybe future directions. So it's I believe it's going to be a light presentation, and I hope you can enjoy some of the information I provided there. And I'm from Nanyang Technological University, NTU in Singapore. So all right, first let me talk about, well, two things I want to talk about as background information. The first is obviously the MSW generation, meaning municipal solid waste generation. I believe many people know what it is, and we are, as geo-environmental researchers, we are very familiar with the MSW. But nevertheless, let me still talk about it for a while. MSW generation is a worldwide problem, as we can see, and we already know. Let me pull out this highlighter here. Because worldwide, all the countries are generating solid waste MSW, and then there are a few major solid waste management options that are used worldwide. So I will take three major countries and regions as an example. They are United States, China, and the European Union. So the first thing I want to point out is the amount of the solid waste generation per year. As we can see here, for US, China, and the European Union, the amount are more or less similar. Let me hide. Meaning other three regions generate on the order of hundreds million tons of municipal solid waste per year. The other thing I want to point out is the four major solid waste management options, meaning in the different countries, they always rely on recycling, incineration, composting, and landfilling as the major disposal methods for municipal solid waste. Although the actual numbers are going to be different in the States, China, and the European Union. In the United States and European Union, we can imagine, they have strict policies and they have more advanced technologies. So more of the waste are actually incinerated or recycled, but still a significant amount of the waste is landfilled, as you can see here. In the US, in the European Union, around 40%. In China, we have around 60% of the solid waste that are disposed of in so-called sanitary landfills, and around 8% of the waste goes to dump sites. These are less controlled landfills. So obviously, we know that solid waste generation is a problem we have to deal with. We have to solve this problem properly. And land disposal is a major method we rely on to treat solid waste now and also in the near future. And then still rely on the data from this water waste report that's generated by the United Nations, by the World Bank. I can further calculate something else. So by knowing the amount of the waste that's generated per capita in each country, and also their disposal methods, meaning how much waste is landfilled, we can calculate the so-called total MSW disposal worldwide in a year. And that number is going to be a very big number, 1.5 billion tons. That's just in 1 year, how much waste is disposed of inland, meaning using dump sites and landfills worldwide. We can also see that, the three major countries with the most waste landfilled are US, China, and India. But also many other countries that are marked in the red color and the yellow color, they indicate that these countries are disposing or landfilling waste on the order of tens of million tons. So overall, we know that worldwide, there are many land disposal sites, meaning landfills and dump sites, that are receiving continuously municipal solid waste from our cities and from our society. Meaning solid waste disposal is a common practice, and then landfill sites, dump sites are almost omnipresent in the environment right now. For those landfill sites, I mentioned briefly before, many of these are so-called dump sites, meaning they are not properly controlled or they don't have proper infrastructure to stop the waste from contaminating the environment. And these dumps, so I here take another screenshot from another recent report that is listed here. So these this figure shows that many of the LMC, meaning low-income countries or low-medium-income countries and even upper-medium-income countries, are disposing of solid waste in the dump sites, not in the so-called controlled or sanitary landfills. So the dump sites, in the dump sites, the waste are not very properly controlled, as you can see in those photos below here, meaning people dump the waste, they throw the waste in there, and later on, the waste are all these wastes are very likely going to be re-entered or so-called re-exposed to the environment because of the poor engineered controls. Only in the high-income countries and parts of the upper middle-income countries, they can afford so-called proper landfills to contain and really isolate the waste from the environment. So here I just put another figure showing you a typical cross-sectional view of the landfills. This, I believe, all of us knows very well. These are ideal landfills that we throw the waste in, and then we can control them nicely. But just bear in mind that many times or many places in the world, the so-called ideal landfills do not exist, and then we are actually throwing waste into dump sites, which are not well controlled. So I'm going to skip this slide. Essentially, this slide, these four photos are showing some major big landfills inside or at the center of some modern cities. So just to summarize very quickly, what I have said so far is that we have to deal with the MSW problem, and then landfills and dump sites are the major methods we rely on to deal with, to dispose of solid waste these days. Another problem I'm going to talk about for a while is the plastic waste problem. I believe we all know that it's a very hot topic these days, and it's a pressing problem as we understand. First, I want to highlight to you that this special issue published by Science just 2 weeks ago, as you can see here on July the 2nd, 2021. This issue focused only or solely on the plastic problem called Our Plastic Dilemmas. So this Science issue is highlighting many things. Obviously, I'm only going to show you some things that are the most relevant to my talk today. So plastic problem we know is contaminating the whole environment, is damaging the ocean environment especially, and then the plastics are actually coming from our daily activity. So to put it into a better perspective, let me show you this other figure. It's also from a science paper, but a few years ago. What I want to show you here is that, especially those two arrows below. So for the plastic waste problem, people first realize or notice this problem in the ocean environment. That is essentially showing, or this is the meaning of this arrow here. Sorry, the arrow below, the black arrow here. It says that the trends of plastic waste research starts in the ocean or in the marine environment, the aquatic environment, then gradually moves on to the so-called terrestrial environment, meaning in the soil and on land, where all these plastic wastes are generated. On the other hand, the flow of the plastic is actually from the land to the ocean, meaning from the human activities, from manufacturing, waste generation, waste disposal to the natural environment. But nevertheless, I think many of us have this feeling that we see so many different plastic waste and microplastic research papers these days. Most of them are focused on the marine environment, meaning freshwater, wastewater, maybe ecology, toxicology, and etc. Only a few papers talk about the plastic waste pollution, microplastic presence in the soil environment, terrestrial environment, or so-called in the solid waste related activities. But I believe this is going to be the trend, like it's shown here, because we do have to understand where do all these plastic waste come from, how they are entering the environment, and etc. So that is kind of gradually getting into my point today, meaning we have to understand the plastic waste disposal, especially in landfills and dump sites. All right, move on to the next figure. This figure is taken actually from the very recent science issue, the special issue on the plastic waste problem. So what I want to just highlight, oh, this is a
sorry, Professor Fei, your PPT sharing is stopped. Could you
at which
relink?
slide?
Your screen sharing is stopped. Could you relink?
Okay, yes, let me see. Now it's shared again, right?
Yeah, now it works.
So it probably stopped a few slides ago. Anyway, I'm going to just continue with from the current slide. Well,
Yes, please.
later on I will send the PPT. But anyway, these are some of them are just photos, you know. So I'm going to move on to right now. I'm talking about this slide. Background information or background knowledge about plastic waste. This is a busy figure. Essentially, it's taken from the science paper that's very recently published, 2021. It's a busy figure, but nevertheless, I'm going to just pick out a few things to discuss with you. Basically, you know, this figure is showing the overall plastic waste flow in the world, meaning everywhere. But I circled here the focus of this talk today, meaning if you see the numbers here, these numbers are the amount of all the plastics that are ever made. And what we can see here is, you know, there are around 2,000 million tons of plastic waste, plastic products that are still in use. How much plastic waste is actually generated and disposed? It's this number here, 4,000 million tons. So we can see that, you know, the majority, actually the predominant amount of the plastic waste, plastic products that are generated are actually discarded and become waste. And they are primarily stored in landfills and dump sites, as indicated here. Later on, if you are interested, you can see the other numbers. But you know, all these natural flows numbers, they are very, very small, although we talk about these a lot these days, right? The plastic waste that are flowing into the oceans, that are floating on the surface water, that are littered everywhere. These are, you know, just on the order of a few million tons. On the other hand, we have around 4,000 million tons of plastic waste in landfills and dump sites. So that's where I think the two major points come together, meaning, well, first we are disposing or we are landfilling waste, solid waste every day, everywhere. And then we are landfilling a major amount of plastic waste in the landfills and dump sites. Then my real question for the talk today is that, okay, what's going to happen to these plastic waste that are disposed of in landfills and dump sites? This figure is just basically summarizing what I have said before, but I do want to highlight this box one more time. This is essentially showing that, you know, for all the plastics ever made, around 40% of them become plastic waste and they are disposed of in landfills. And then around 30% of them are disposed of in so-called dump sites, including some of the open burning of plastic waste. So that's why essentially landfills and dump sites are very critical in understanding and solving the plastic waste problems nowadays globally. This is just summarized as summarized here. Most plastic waste are disposed of in dump sites and landfills. So that's a major problem for us to understand and maybe to solve in the future. All right, so let me summarize again briefly. The objectives of this talk of the next 20 minutes is to assess and summarize the current knowledge of land-disposed plastic waste and microplastics. And especially my focus will be on three things: the quantity and the distribution of the plastic waste in the landfills, their long-term behaviors, that's a summary, and then I will try to assess, evaluate the re-exposure and release potentials of the plastic waste and microplastics to the environment from the land disposal site. All right, so so this is kind of a literature review, and I first start with the plastic waste disposal. Well, again, Although it's called a literature review, but we did some extensive data analysis and calculations and figure making. So these figures, all the figures afterwards, are made by my team, and the tables are made by my team. So the paper is submitted. It's not published yet, but if you are interested, you can check the paper later. On this slide, what I'm showing is the trends of plastic waste generation and disposal in different countries and worldwide. So first, we see here, this is the trend worldwide. The black triangles here are showing how much plastic wastage is generated every year from 1850s to 2020. The red triangles are showing how much of these plastic waste are landfilled cumulatively. We can see that this trend is kind of flattening out, which is primarily due to two things. One is the promoted recycling of the plastic waste, and then the other thing is the increased incineration rate or ratio of the plastic waste. Then we can break it down, or we can break these numbers down to see for different countries and regions how they are dealing with the plastic waste. In China, we can see a certain portion of the plastic waste is still being land disposed, as you can see here for the red triangles. It is very similar for the United States. We see that part of the plastic waste are recycled, but still much of it are still landfilled. The only region that is doing much better is actually the European Union. You can see that the amount of the cumulative, the cumulative amount of the, the annual amount of plastic waste disposal in the European Union remains stable for a long period of time. This is essentially because of their socioeconomic status and policy, meaning they emphasize and encourage a lot the plastic waste recycling and also incineration. So very little fresh and raw plastic waste enters the landfills. This figure to the right here is showing some other major countries in the world where we can find the plastic waste data and how do they do. So the major conclusion here we can make is that, for many of the developing countries, including China and Brazil, South Africa, India, and etc., Thailand, and maybe others, the amount of plastic waste that are entering the landfills and dump sites are still increasing every year, meaning we are not only looking at how we can contain the plastic waste in landfills for the existing plastic waste. We also have to think about in the future, near future, how do we deal with the plastic waste safely in landfills and dump sites. So moving on, we know there are so much plastic waste in landfills and maybe microplastics in the landfills as well. What are going to happen to these plastic waste in the landfills? So we make this summary figure, two summary figures here to basically show you that these are the potential long-term processes or reactions that are going to happen to the plastic waste. I'm not going to describe all these reactions in much details and mechanisms, but I'm going to first read them all. The major reactions are going to be a bunch of different degradation processes: photo degradation, thermal degradation, and also catalytic degradation, leaching, and etc., biodegradation as well. So all these are degradation processes that are going to happen to the plastic waste under landfill conditions. In addition, we also have mechanical wearing, meaning the damaging of the plastics by the forces, shear force, compression force, and etc. And then finally, we'll also have a pneumatic and hydrological transport of the plastic waste and microplastics from the waste to the environment potentially. Just remember that some of you may have noticed, there are two very recent papers that are showing that microplastics have been found in landfill leachates. These are published, I believe, by He Pingjing, a very famous professor in Tongji University, and another paper is published by ECNU, Xue Bingyin ECNU. So they are the first people that are reporting the detections of microplastics in landfill leachates, meaning that, we store the plastic waste in landfills. We hope that they do not change at all. So they are not threatening the environment, but these are not the cases, meaning they will eventually break down to microplastics and then they will be carried out by the leachate or maybe even by the wind and etc. to contaminate further the environment in the future. So there are quite a few things that are going on. We need to first understand what are the so-called long-term processes, and later on we can think about how to do the proper monitoring, mitigation, and engineered controls for the plastic waste and microplastic. Then move on to talk about the last part of the presentation today. We also summarize, well, basically we flip through maybe 200 to 300 different papers, and then we summarize so-called different re-exposure and release pathways for the plastic waste and microplastics from the landfills. So let me also explain this a bit further, what we consider as re-exposure and release. Re-exposure is essentially the re-exposure of biogas, solid waste, and or leachate from the land disposal site. So because these waste, gas, or leachate, they contain plastic waste or microplastics. So they first of all, they have to be re-exposed to the environment. And then these re-exposed solid, liquid, and gas can carry microplastics and plastics to the environment by the next step, which is called actual release step of the plastic waste from the disposal sites. So again, I'm not going to explain all these details here. It's a pretty busy figure. Later on, if you are interested, you can check my slides and our paper. Basically, I just want to say that, you know, we summarize and we think there are the re-exposure of the plastic waste is very much site dependent, meaning that for the dump site, and dump sites meaning the not well-controlled landfills, and then the sanitary and well-controlled landfills, the re-exposure pathways are very different, and then also the probability of re-exposure of waste are very different. Then whenever the waste, the gas, or the leachate is re-exposed to the environment, they will carry plastic waste and microplastics to the environment. And then these releases are characterized into three major transport pathways, which are called manual pathway, waterborne pathway, and also airborne pathway. I will explain them in a bit more details later. So just remember that for a landfill, it's not 100% safe. And then even if it's safe for now, in the long term, it may fail. And later on, we'll talk about several potential failure mechanisms. And if it fails, it will release or it will re-expose the solid waste and leachate and gas to the environment. And then these solid leachate and gas, they will carry microplastics primarily to the environment. So basically, we hope the landfills are so-called permanent sinks or terminals for plastic waste and microplastics. But the reality is that, you know, in the long term, they are going to leak plastic waste and microplastics to the environment, meaning we do have to think more about how to permanently contain the plastic waste in the disposal sites instead of releasing them to the environment in the future. All right, so the next thing we've done in the review is actually to carry out a so-called level assessment for the re-exposure and release. This assessment, well, it's a risk assessment, so I believe many of you should be familiar with this approach, right? We first kind of qualify and semi-quantify how much, for example, how much waste can be released from a site at a certain time, and then how much of this site are vulnerable to the release in the long term, and etc. So we give them some levels and scores, and eventually if we combine the so-called probability versus the impact, we can come up with a risk level or a re-exposure level or re-exposure score. So the lower the score, the safer we are. The higher the score, meaning that it's very likely going to happen and it's going to have a major impact on the environment. So I took another screenshot for this big table. In this table, essentially what we've done is to summarize the literature, as you can see here. For example, for the dump site exposure, we've gone through many literatures and we try to look for the numbers, especially the percentage numbers, meaning that we will see, For example, one study is saying that around 50% of the dump sites are going to leak solid waste to the environment in the next 5 years, or and etc. So we look for all these percentage numbers, and then we summarize as much as we can in this table here. Also, I'm not going to tell you all the details, but this is basically the methodology we are using to use to look for different good studies and then put their numbers and pull out their numbers to come up with the probability of the waste re-exposure. Similarly, we can also summarize the impact of each re-exposure. And then as you can see here, we have all the references and etc. So then by multiplying the probability by the impact, we can come up with a re-exposure score or re-exposure level, as you can see here. And then we have from very low to very high 5 different levels. But obviously, I'm not going to read the big table because it's going to be very tedious and time-consuming. I'm only going to show some of the major results here. So for the re-exposure assessment, here we look into different re-exposure pathways that are only applicable to dump sites. Some of them are applicable to both the dump sites and landfills. For example, slope failure, waste mining, coastal erosion, flooding, and etc. Then we did all these probability multiplied by impact analysis and come up with re-exposure levels. So what are the results? We can see here that dump sites are very obviously the most important or the most likely pathways to re-expose the waste, liquid, and gas that's containing plastic waste to the environment. So they have very high scores for all these categories. For the others, for example, slope failure, waste mining, and etc. And then also in the next slide, I'm showing more of the other types of landfill failures. But for these cases, mostly, the level or the score is not very high, meaning they are not very likely going to release a huge amount of plastic waste and microplastics to the environment. The other two things that we need to keep in mind are contaminant leakage and leachate collection from the sanitary landfills. They are going to transport a significant amount of microplastics from the disposal sites, from the landfills, to the other environments. So just to summarize the re-exposure levels here, dump site disposal, contaminant leakage, and leachate collections are going to be the major re-exposure pathways. Now we move on to talk about the last part of my talk today, is the release pathways of the plastics waste and microplastics. I'm going to skip this, this slide, which shows the methodology again, but it's very similar. It's a semi-quantitative risk assessment approach. So what we did again is very similar. We first know that the waste is exposed. Then we want to see the exposed waste. How does the exposed waste transport to the environment? Meaning they are transported manually by scavenging and recycling, by waste mining and treatment, and also they can be transported by the natural forces, meaning the waterborne pathways and airborne pathways. So among all these pathways, and after all the assessments and analysis, what we can see here is that, for the plastic waste, the most likely release pathways are scavenging from the dump sites. This is, I think, very easy to imagine. And also mining of the dump sites and landfills, meaning displace the plastic waste to other places for further treatment. These are essentially the two dominant pathways for the plastic waste, meaning the big pieces of the plastics to leave the landfills and dump sites. For microplastics, we have quite a few different pathways. So I'm going to just read them quickly here. Scavenging, waste mining, leachate leakage, and also leachate treatment. These are the dominant pathways for microplastics to leave the disposal sites. The next slide is not showing much, meaning all the airborne pathways are going to just contribute minimally to the environmental release of microplastics and plastics. All right, just to quickly summarize what I have talked about here. Again, this is a pretty high level introductory and qualitative analysis of the plastic waste and landfills. So I briefly talk about what are the potential long-term processes that are going to happen in the landfills to plastic waste. And then we list all the re-exposure and release pathways and then assess their probabilities, meaning how likely are they going to be a critical issue. So later on, what can we do? We can obviously think about the in situ monitoring, the lab tests, the full-scale mitigations, and even the policy makings that are targeting to reduce the threats of the plastic waste and microplastics to the environment. So that's pretty much it. The last thing I do want to highlight, although I'm not going to talk in details, is that in the paper we talk more. Obviously, we summarize all these the reports from actual sites, and then we did all these statistical analysis, and then we plot all these. But again, because of the time limitation, I'm not going to talk about these. Again, if you're interested, please keep an eye on this paper. This review paper is under review now, and we hope it's going to be finalized soon. Again, if you're interested, please check with me later, or you can check the Google Scholar. Thank you for your attention today.